She defensively told the underwriter that she was the primary administrator of a highly successful elite medical practice, and she demanded to know why the funds had not been released yet. The underwriter laughed a harsh, bitter laugh. He told her that her loan application was officially denied and permanently flagged in their commercial system for severe suspected fraud. Melissa gasped and demanded an immediate explanation. She started yelling about her pristine credit score and the massive daily revenue of the clinic. The underwriter quickly cut her off and delivered the ultimate killing blow. He told her that her credit score was completely irrelevant because she did not actually own a single valuable asset inside her entire building. He explained that his legal team had just pulled the state commercial registry files. He told her that there was a massive senior secured lien currently active on absolutely every single asset associated with the medical practice. Melissa was completely ignorant regarding complex commercial finance. She angrily asked him what a senior lien meant. She truly believed that because her name was on the building lease, she possessed total ownership of the business. The underwriter was more than happy to educate her. He read the exact legal terms of the 80-page operating agreement she had foolishly signed at my dining room table months ago. He told her that the senior lien meant a primary investor held absolute total ownership over everything the clinic possessed until a $900,000 debt was completely repaid with interest. He aggressively listed the exact assets covered under the ironclad contract. He told her the lien completely covered the expensive Italian marble desk she was currently sitting behind. It covered the plush velvet furniture in her beautiful waiting room. It covered every single computer monitor and every piece of office technology. He kept reading down the comprehensive legal list, and the reality of her nightmare grew darker with every single word. The lien covered the entire intellectual property of the business. That meant the actual registered name of the dermatology clinic did not belong to her. The massive digital database containing the names, phone numbers, and private emails of every single wealthy socialite Aaron had ever treated did not belong to her. Even the future projected receivables, meaning every single dollar any patient ever paid them for a procedure, was legally pledged to the senior lien holder. Then the underwriter addressed the medical equipment. He aggressively scolded her for attempting to pledge the high-tech surgical lasers as loan collateral. He told her his legal team had already spoken with the primary vendor holding the equipment lease. He informed her that pledging leased corporate assets was a massive federal crime, and he was legally obligated to report her fraudulent loan application to the National Commercial Fraud Registry. He told her that no reputable or alternative bank in the country would ever lend her a single dime again. Melissa was completely paralyzed. The heavy phone trembled in her manicured hand. Her entire arrogant reality was violently crashing down around her. She had spent months treating me like a pathetic, irrelevant old fool. She had mocked my worn clothes and laughed at my quiet demeanor. She truly believed she had easily stolen my entire life savings to build her luxurious empire. Now a stranger on the phone was aggressively explaining that she was nothing but a temporary, uninvited guest sitting inside a financial fortress that I had masterfully built around her. Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. She asked the underwriter exactly who held this massive senior lien. She asked who legally owned the medical supply company that held the laser leases. She was desperately praying that it was some massive faceless banking conglomerate she could somehow beg or negotiate with. The underwriter clearly read the registered name off the state document. He told her the senior lien holder and the absolute owner of her entire operation was a private commercial holding company entirely controlled by a man named Warren Gallagher. The underwriter hung up the phone, leaving Melissa completely alone in the deafening silence of her beautiful office. Simon told me that according to the receptionist who later gossiped about the event, Melissa actually dropped the phone onto the floor and physically collapsed into her chair. She looked around the pristine, luxurious room and suddenly realized the absolute terrifying truth. Every single thing she looked at belonged to me. The walls belonged to me. The art belonged to me. The expensive eucalyptus diffusers belonged to me. Even the sterile bandages and the specialized chemical compounds she needed to run the business belonged entirely to me. She had absolutely nothing. The massive shadow consulting company she had created to embezzle my money was completely useless because there was no more money left to steal. The luxury sports car sitting in the reserved parking spot was completely irrelevant because she could not afford the massive monthly payments without her fraudulent salary. She was completely trapped inside a beautiful glass cage, and I was the one holding the only key. She realized that every single arrogant decision she had made over the past 6 months had simply tightened the noose around her own neck. When she refused to invite me to the grand opening, she sealed her fate. When she called me demanding the Phase 2 operating capital while treating me like an automated teller machine, she guaranteed her own destruction. She finally understood that my quiet patience was not weakness. It was the calculated silence of a seasoned predator perfectly measuring the distance before the final lethal strike. She could not call me to beg for forgiveness, because she knew I had already cut her off entirely. She could not fix the massive supply chain issue because the vendor she owed $80,000 to was actually me. She had nowhere left to run and nobody left to manipulate. The brick wall she hit was made of solid concrete and ironclad legal contracts. The most terrifying part of her realization was that she now had to face her husband. Aaron was currently out in the lobby, desperately trying to salvage his ruined internet reputation after canceling the procedure on the wealthy influencer. He still believed the massive catastrophe was simply a banking error. He still believed his beautiful wife was a brilliant clinic administrator. Melissa knew she had to walk out of her office and look him straight in the eyes. She had to tell him that they were completely bankrupt. She had to confess that she had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars to fund her own vanity. She had to admit that his entire medical practice, his patient list, and his professional future now legally belonged to the father they had both treated like absolute garbage. If she lied to him again, the alternative lender was going to report her to the fraud registry, and she would face federal criminal charges. The absolute unified front of their shared greed was officially fractured. The stress of the financial trap was about to turn the two thieves completely against each other. I thanked Simon for his excellent work and ended the call. I set my phone down on the coffee table and leaned back in my chair. The sun had completely set, leaving the living room, bathed in the quiet, peaceful glow of the streetlights outside. For the first time since my wife passed away, I felt a genuine sense of deep, profound calm. The painful, agonizing hope that my son would eventually learn to respect me was completely gone. It was replaced by the clean, undeniable satisfaction of absolute justice. I did not need to scream or cry or throw things to prove my point. I simply used the brutal mechanical reality of the world to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The first phase of the collapse was completely finished. The illusion of their wealth was shattered, and the heavy chains of consequence were securely wrapped around their throats. Now all I had to do was wait for the morning to arrive. I knew exactly what would happen when the sun came up. They would come to my house. They would come desperately crawling back to the man they had discarded, completely unaware that the guillotine was already perfectly positioned over their heads. I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and began to prepare my dinner. I had a very busy day scheduled for tomorrow, and I needed to be perfectly rested for the final absolute dismantling of their fake empire. The sun had barely risen above the tree line the next morning when the chaotic sound of tires violently tearing up my gravel driveway broke the peaceful silence of my home. I was standing in the kitchen frying eggs and listening to the quiet crackle of the cast iron pan. I did not need to look out the front window to know exactly who had just arrived. The heavy, aggressive slamming of 2 car doors echoed through the morning air, followed instantly by the sound of heavy footsteps storming up my front porch. They did not bother to ring the doorbell or wait for an invitation. The heavy brass doorknob turned violently, and the front door was thrown open with such intense force that it slammed loudly against the interior hallway wall. Aaron and Melissa marched directly into my kitchen, bringing the cold, bitter air of their absolute panic right into my home. I slowly turned off the stove and wiped my hands on a cloth towel, completely ignoring their dramatic entrance. I took a moment to truly look at my son. The polished, arrogant medical visionary who wore custom-tailored white coats and drank complimentary champagne with local celebrities was completely gone. Aaron looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive designer shirt was wrinkled and completely untucked. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were wild with the terrifying exhaustion of a man who had clearly stayed awake all night watching his fake empire burn to the ground. Melissa stood right beside him, looking like a cornered wild animal. Her expensive makeup was heavily smudged, and the arrogant, condescending smirk she always wore around me was permanently erased from her face. She was clutching a leather designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were turning completely white. Aaron did not say good morning. He did not ask how I was doing. He immediately launched into a massive theatrical display of emotional manipulation. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperate panic. He demanded to know exactly what I had done to his medical practice. He yelled that his entire elite internet reputation was completely destroyed because the massive social media influencer had posted a viral video calling him a total fraud. He screamed that his clinic phone was ringing off the hook, with wealthy patients desperately trying to cancel their upcoming appointments because they no longer trusted him. He aggressively pointed his finger directly at my face and accused me of intentionally destroying his lifelong dream. He told me that I was a bitter, jealous old man who could not stand to see his own son achieve true modern success. He claimed that because I had spent my entire life working in the freezing dirt, pouring concrete for a living, I was secretly deeply resentful of his clean, prestigious medical career. I stood there in absolute silence and let him scream. I let him empty his pathetic lungs. When the accusations of jealousy did not provoke an emotional reaction from me, Aaron desperately reached for the ultimate weapon. He decided to use the memory of his dead mother to try and break my spirit. His voice dropped into a pathetic, theatrical whisper as he dramatically asked me what my beautiful late wife would think of me right now. He asked me how I could possibly look at myself in the mirror, knowing I was actively destroying the only child she had ever loved. He swore to me that if his mother were still alive today, she would be absolutely disgusted by my cruel, unforgiving behavior. He told me that she would have gladly given him the $150,000 Phase 2 capital without asking a single question because she actually understood what unconditional family love meant. It was a beautifully constructed emotional trap perfectly designed to make a grieving father completely collapse with guilt and instantly open his wallet. A few months ago, those exact cruel words would have broken my heart into a million pieces. I would have desperately apologized and handed over my life savings just to stop him from looking at me with such intense hatred. But the father who blindly loved that boy had completely died the very moment Melissa told me I was not invited to the clinic grand opening. I looked at my son, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical pity. I saw him for exactly what he was. He was a weak, spoiled man desperately using a dead woman to try and secure a financial bailout. When my continued silence absolutely infuriated Aaron, Melissa decided it was time for her to take control of the situation. She aggressively stepped in front of her husband, completely dropping the emotional manipulation tactics and pulling out what she foolishly believed was a massive legal weapon. She puffed out her chest and tried to look incredibly intimidating. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at me and aggressively threatened to completely destroy me in a court of law. She screamed that she had already spoken to a brilliant team of corporate lawyers. That was a complete lie, of course. No reputable lawyer would ever take her case, but she believed the lie sounded terrifying. She confidently declared that she was filing a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit against me for severe tortious interference. She aggressively accused me of illegally contacting her private commercial lender and intentionally sabotaging her emergency bridge loan application. She screamed that I had absolutely no legal right to speak to the alternative lending group or discuss the private financial matters of her dermatology clinic. She claimed my actions were a highly illegal breach of corporate privacy and a direct malicious attack on her livelihood. She threatened to drag my name through the mud and take away my house, my truck, and my entire retirement fund to compensate her for the extreme emotional distress I had maliciously caused. Melissa truly believed she was delivering a brilliant legal checkmate. She actually thought that throwing around complex legal terms like tortious interference would completely terrify an uneducated blue-collar relic into immediate submission. She demanded that I instantly call the alternative lending group, apologize for my illegal interference, and formally release my senior secured lien on the clinic assets. She promised that if I completely signed over the business to her right now, she would be generous enough to drop the massive lawsuit and let me walk away quietly. I listened to her ridiculous, unhinged demands, and I almost laughed out loud at the sheer magnitude of her delusion. She was standing inside my house threatening to sue me for protecting my own money from her massive embezzlement scheme. She completely believed that because she possessed a loud voice and a designer handbag, she could successfully bully a man who had spent 40 years ruthlessly destroying aggressive commercial competitors. I looked back and forth between the two of them. I saw Aaron desperately clinging to his mother memory, and I saw Melissa desperately clinging to her fake legal threats. They were two drowning rats viciously attacking the only piece of floating wood left in the water, completely unaware that the wood was securely bolted to the bottom of the ocean. They finally stopped yelling. Their chests were heavily heaving as they desperately tried to catch their breath. The loud, chaotic echoes of their screaming slowly faded into the corners of my quiet kitchen. They stood there completely expecting me to finally break. They expected me to start crying, or yelling, or desperately begging for their forgiveness. They expected the familiar, pathetic compliance they had completely trained me to provide. I calmly picked up my mug of black coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, bitter liquid tasted absolutely perfect. I looked directly into my son's eyes, and I saw the very first microscopic trace of genuine fear begin to form in his pupils. He suddenly realized that the old man standing in front of him was not reacting like a guilty father. I was reacting like a brick wall. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their chaotic panic. I simply asked them if they were completely finished throwing their little temper tantrum inside my kitchen. Melissa gasped in absolute shock, and her face turned a bright, furious shade of red. She aggressively opened her mouth to start screaming another barrage of fake legal threats, but I raised my calloused hand and completely silenced her. My voice was incredibly low and dangerously quiet, completely commanding the absolute authority of the room. I told her that she was not going to speak another word in my house. I told her that she was going to stand there and silently listen to exactly how the real world actually works. The ultimate confrontation had finally reached its absolute boiling point. They had fired every single emotional and legal bullet they had in their pathetic weapons, and they had completely missed the target. They were totally out of ammunition, and I was just getting started. I slowly turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen, heading directly toward my home office. I knew they would follow me because they had absolutely nowhere else to go. It was finally time to drop the massive concrete anvil directly onto their fragile glass castle. It was time to show them the folders. I walked out of the kitchen, and my heavy work boots made a slow, rhythmic sound against the hardwood floor. I knew they were following me. I could hear their frantic footsteps trailing right behind me. Aaron and Melissa were completely silent now. The sheer, unyielding confidence in my posture had successfully suffocated their chaotic yelling. I stepped into my home office and the atmosphere immediately shifted. This was not a warm family living room. This was a room built for ruthless commercial warfare. The walls were lined with heavy wooden bookshelves holding decades of complex real estate ledgers and legal texts. The morning sun poured through the large window, casting a bright, unforgiving light directly onto my massive oak desk. I walked behind the desk and slowly sat down in my heavy leather chair. Aaron and Melissa stood awkwardly on the other side of the desk, looking like two guilty children called into the principal office. They completely expected me to start arguing with them. They were aggressively prepared for a loud, emotional shouting match where we would violently trade insults until someone finally apologized. I refused to give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Anger is a completely useless emotion that only clouds your judgment when you are executing a perfect legal kill. I rested my calloused hands flat against the polished wood of my desk. Sitting directly in front of me, perfectly aligned in a neat row, were 3 thick manila folders. I looked at my son. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed. He was nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot, completely terrified of the absolute silence in the room. I reached out and slowly opened the very first folder. I slid it across the smooth wooden surface until it rested perfectly in front of him. I told him to look closely at the document inside. I told him it was the exact same 80-page operating agreement he and his wife had so eagerly signed at my dining room table just a few months ago. Aaron looked down at the paper, and I saw his eyes desperately scanning the complex legal jargon. I calmly explained the brutal reality of his situation. I told him that he had spent his entire adult life believing he was a brilliant self-made medical visionary. He truly believed he owned a highly successful luxury dermatology practice. I shattered that beautiful illusion with a single sentence. I told him that the $900,000 I gave him was never a generous family gift. It was a comprehensive senior secured loan, and he did not actually own a single piece of his own business. I pointed to the specific paragraphs outlining the massive lien I held over his entire medical operation. I explained that every single patient file, every piece of waiting room furniture, and every drop of cosmetic chemicals legally belonged to me. I watched the color completely drain from his face as he finally realized the massive legal chain wrapped tightly around his neck. Then I delivered the first fatal blow. I directed his attention to the strict default clause buried deep inside the contract. I explained that the restricted capital was legally mandated to be used exclusively for the outright purchase of medical equipment to secure the loan collateral. I told him I knew exactly what he and his wife had done. I told him I knew they had maliciously leased the laser machines to artificially preserve the cash for their own luxury salaries. I explained that by intentionally leasing the equipment, they had completely violated the core financial covenant and triggered an immediate catastrophic default on the $900,000 loan. Aaron started to panic. He opened his mouth to formulate a desperate, pathetic excuse. He wanted to blame the supply chain or claim it was just a temporary business strategy. I raised my hand and completely silenced him. I told him I was not interested in his pathetic lies because the truth was sitting right in the second folder. I reached out and flipped open the second thick manila folder. I pushed the massive stack of forensic accounting documents across the desk, completely covering the legal contract. I looked directly at Melissa. She was staring at the accounting papers, and her entire body began to tremble uncontrollably. She recognized the official bank logos printed at the top of the pages. She knew exactly what I was showing them. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the quiet room like a razor blade. I told Aaron that his brilliant clinic administrator was not just incompetent. She was a calculated, ruthless criminal. I explained that my legal team had executed a comprehensive forensic audit of the primary clinic bank accounts. I told my son to look at the long list of massive wire transfers highlighted in bright yellow ink. I explained that for the past several months, Melissa had been aggressively siphoning the operational budget to a completely fake shadow corporation called Apex Lifestyle Management. Aaron looked completely horrified. He stared down at the highlighted numbers and then looked up at his wife. He asked her what Apex Lifestyle Management was, and his voice was completely trembling with fear. Melissa could not even look him in the eye. She stared down at the floor, completely paralyzed by the massive, undeniable proof of her absolute betrayal. I answered the question for him. I told Aaron that Apex Lifestyle Management was a fraudulent shell company completely owned and operated by his own wife. I explained that she had been billing his medical practice tens of thousands of dollars every single month for completely fabricated marketing and consulting services. I pulled out her personal bank statements and laid them flat on the desk for him to see. I showed him exactly where his clinic operating funds were actually going. I pointed to the massive down payment for her slate gray Porsche. I pointed to the thousands of dollars spent at high-end designer clothing boutiques and luxury weekend spa retreats. I explained that the reason his medical supply cabinets were completely empty yesterday was not because of a sudden, unexplainable banking error. It was because his wife was intentionally starving his medical practice to death just to fund her own endless vanity. She had completely ignored 2 months of critical vendor invoices, prioritizing her fake consulting fees over the basic sterile bandages he desperately needed to perform his job. I told him that the massive social media disaster he suffered yesterday was entirely orchestrated by the woman standing right next to him. The absolute unified front of their shared greed completely shattered right in front of my eyes. Aaron turned to Melissa, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He realized that she had intentionally destroyed his precious elite reputation just to buy expensive shoes and luxury cars. He started yelling at her, demanding to know how she could possibly do this to him. He called her a thief and a liar. He completely forgot about the massive lawsuit she had threatened me with just 10 minutes ago. He completely forgot about his dead mother. He only cared about the horrifying fact that his wife had completely bankrupted his professional future. Melissa tried to desperately defend herself. She started crying and stammering, claiming that she only took the money because she deserved a proper luxury lifestyle for managing such a stressful business. She tried to blame Aaron, saying he was always too busy playing doctor with local celebrities to ever look at the financial books. They began viciously tearing each other apart right inside my office. The stress of the trap was crushing them, and they were turning on each other like starved wolves. I let them scream at each other for a few moments, watching their toxic marriage completely disintegrate under the crushing weight of the truth. Then I picked up the third folder. The heavy sound of the thick manila folder hitting the wooden desk instantly silenced them. They both turned back to look at me, completely terrified of what final nightmare I was about to unleash. I opened the final folder and slowly slid the official commercial foreclosure notices across the desk. I told them that the forensic audit was just the beginning of their punishment. I explained that because they had intentionally triggered the massive default clause in the operating agreement, I had formally exercised my absolute legal right as the senior secured creditor. I pointed to the top document and explained the brutal reality of their current situation. I told them I had completely seized total legal ownership of the dermatology clinic. I told them that the business no longer belonged to them in any capacity. I owned the building lease, I owned the intellectual property, I owned the expensive Italian marble desk, and I owned every single future patient receivable. Melissa desperately tried to find a way out of the trap. She pointed her shaking finger at me and tearfully claimed that she was going to use the emergency bridge loan to pay off the medical supply vendor and save the clinic. She told me the loan was already in process and the money would be deposited by the end of the day. I smiled a very cold, entirely genuine smile. I told her that she was completely delusional. I informed her that the alternative lending group had officially permanently denied her fraudulent loan application yesterday afternoon. I explained that the underwriter called my legal team directly because I was registered as the senior lien holder on the state commercial registry. I told her I personally instructed my lawyer to inform the bank that she was attempting to illegally pledge leased medical equipment as commercial collateral. Melissa physically stumbled backward as if I had just punched her directly in the chest. She finally realized that the terrifying phone call she received from the loan underwriter yesterday was entirely orchestrated by me. She realized I had completely isolated them from every single financial resource in the entire city. Aaron looked completely defeated. His shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant fire was completely gone from his eyes. He asked me in a tiny, pathetic whisper what was going to happen next. He asked me how he was supposed to perform his scheduled cosmetic procedures today without any medical supplies or access to the clinic bank accounts. I looked at my son and delivered the final absolute consequence of his incredible arrogance. I told him that he was not going to perform any procedures today. I told him that he was never going to step foot inside that beautiful luxury clinic ever again. I explained that while they were busy driving over here to scream at me in my kitchen, my private legal team was currently standing at the clinic with local law enforcement officers. The locks on the heavy glass doors were being completely changed. A formal legal notice of commercial foreclosure was being taped directly to the front window for every single wealthy patient and local celebrity to see. I told them the game was completely over. The fake glamorous life they had built using my stolen retirement funds was officially permanently terminated. I told them they had exactly 10 minutes to pack their personal belongings and get out of my house before I called the police and had them formally arrested for trespassing and federal commercial fraud. I closed the 3 empty folders and completely ignored their desperate sobbing. The absolute dismantling was finished. I watched the heavy reality of the commercial foreclosure notices completely crush the last remaining ounce of their defiance. The beautiful glass castle they had built with my money was gone. The fake empire was completely dead. But the absolute worst part of their nightmare was not the loss of the luxury clinic. The worst part was the second folder sitting open on my desk. The comprehensive forensic accounting documents were the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and severe embezzlement. Melissa stared at those bank statements with wide, terrified eyes. She knew exactly what happens to people who steal secured corporate funds and forge legal documents to secure predatory loans. She was looking at a massive federal prison sentence. In that terrifying moment of absolute self-preservation, the shallow vows of her marriage completely evaporated into thin air. She did not turn to her husband for comfort or support. She turned on him like a cornered snake completely desperate to survive. Melissa pointed a shaking finger directly at Aaron, and her voice became high and shrill with absolute panic. She looked at me and frantically claimed that Aaron knew absolutely everything about the shadow consulting company. She swore to me that he had given her complete verbal authorization to set up the fraudulent entity. She claimed that he was the one who told her to lease the expensive medical equipment because he wanted to keep the cash reserves extremely high to fund their lavish personal lifestyle. She was lying through her teeth, of course. She was desperately trying to distribute the massive criminal liability. If she was going to drown, she was completely determined to drag her husband down into the dark water right alongside her. She yelled that Aaron was the registered medical director and the primary owner on the corporate paperwork, so he was legally responsible for every single financial decision she made. She told me that Aaron was just playing stupid, and that he happily enjoyed driving the luxury sports car and taking the expensive vacations she paid for with the stolen money. She tried to paint him as the criminal mastermind, while claiming she was just a devoted wife following his direct orders. Aaron looked at his wife as if she had just physically stabbed him directly in the chest. The golden boy of the elite medical world, the arrogant dermatologist who truly thought he was completely untouchable, suddenly realized that his own wife was actively framing him for a massive federal crime. His face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute hatred. The shock quickly mutated into a violent, explosive rage. He stepped aggressively toward her, completely invading her personal space. He yelled that she was a toxic, delusional parasite. He screamed that he never authorized a single penny to go to her fake consulting firm. He reminded her that he was the one actually working grueling 14-hour days, dealing with the demanding patients, and building the medical brand while she sat in her imported marble office shopping for designer clothes online. He called her completely useless. He said she brought absolutely nothing of value to the business or to his life. He screamed that he only let her pretend to be the clinic administrator because she constantly complained about being bored at home and he was tired of listening to her whine. He told her she was nothing but a glorified receptionist who had completely destroyed his entire future out of pure selfish vanity. The words he used were incredibly cruel and deeply personal. The thin, polished veneer of their upper-class marriage was entirely stripped away, leaving only the ugly, rotting foundation of mutual opportunism. They did not actually love each other. They only loved the money and the elite social status that the money provided. Now that the money was completely gone, the status was permanently destroyed, and the police were actively changing the locks on their building, there was absolutely nothing left to hold them together. Melissa aggressively pushed him away and screamed right back in his face. She completely dropped the innocent wife act and viciously mocked his elite medical reputation. She told him he was a pathetic fake doctor who only cared about getting invited to wealthy parties and taking pictures with social media influencers. She laughed a harsh, hysterical laugh and told him that none of those wealthy socialites actually respected him at all. She said they only used him for free cosmetic laser treatments and constantly laughed at him behind his back. She screamed that he was a weak, spineless man who had to run to his elderly father for capital because he was too incompetent to secure a real commercial loan on his own merits. Aaron raised his hands and grabbed his own hair in absolute frustration. He looked like a man who was completely losing his mind. He yelled that he was going to hire his own aggressive criminal defense attorney the very second he left my house. He told her he was going to hand over every single personal email, every text message, and every financial password to the federal investigators to prove that she acted completely alone. He swore to her that he would gladly testify against her in open federal court and happily watch her go to prison just to save his own medical license. She laughed right in his face and told him he was incredibly stupid for thinking he could escape the damage. She reminded him that the predatory loan application she submitted yesterday, the one that was permanently flagged for severe commercial fraud, contained his forged digital signature. She told him the federal financial investigators would see his name stamped right on the fraudulent application, and they would never believe he was an innocent victim. She told him that because they were legally married, the authorities would completely freeze all of their shared assets, including his personal bank accounts and the luxury townhouse they lived in. She smiled a vicious, cruel smile and told him they were both going down together and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. I sat quietly in my heavy leather chair and watched the spectacular, violent implosion of their shared life. I did not interrupt them. I did not try to calm them down or offer any parental guidance. I simply folded my calloused hands on the desk and observed the chaotic destruction. This was the true cost of unearned comfort. This was the absolute consequence of treating people like disposable resources. When you build a relationship entirely on a foundation of greed and vanity, the slightest pressure will cause the entire structure to violently collapse and completely crush everyone trapped inside. I thought about my late wife and the beautiful, strong marriage we had built over 40 years. We built our life on mutual respect, deep loyalty, and quiet sacrifice. We survived financial hardships and terrible storms because we actually valued each other more than the money. Looking at my son and his wife, I realized they had absolutely no idea what true loyalty even looked like. They completely forgot that I was even in the room. They paced back and forth across my home office, screaming terrible, vicious accusations at each other. They verbally tore each other to pieces, leaving absolutely nothing sacred untouched. I looked at the heavy brass clock sitting on my desk. The smooth second hand steadily swept across the face. The 10 minutes I had generously given them were almost completely gone. I slowly stood up from my chair. The simple movement caught their attention, and their chaotic screaming abruptly stopped. They turned to look at me completely out of breath, their faces flushed with extreme anger and pure terror. The heavy silence rushed back into the room, settling over us like a thick, dark blanket. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, steady rhythm of a man who was completely finished with a long, tedious job. I told them that their 10 minutes were officially up. I pointed toward the hallway leading to the front door. I told them to get out of my house immediately. I told them to take their toxic, pathetic drama out of my home and deal with the horrific criminal consequences of their actions on their own time. Aaron looked at me and his eyes suddenly filled with desperate, pathetic tears. He took a small, tentative step toward my desk. He opened his mouth to try and beg one last time, to try and appeal to the Father who used to love him unconditionally. He desperately wanted me to save him from his wife, from the federal investigators, and from the absolute ruin he was currently facing. He wanted me to make the nightmare go away, just like I had always done when he was a child. I stared right through him, completely unmoved by his tears. I told him that the protective father he was looking for was completely dead. I told him that he and his wife had killed that man the very day they decided my lifelong sacrifice was nothing more than a convenient automated teller machine to fund their fake reality. I told him I was just the senior secured creditor now, and the secured creditor does not offer emotional support or financial bailouts. I picked up my cell phone from the desk and held it firmly in my hand. I calmly informed them that if they did not turn around and walk out the front door right this exact second, I would dial the police and have them forcefully removed for trespassing. The absolute cold finality in my voice completely broke whatever remaining resistance they had left. Aaron slowly lowered his head. He looked completely hollow, entirely drained of his massive ego and his fake prestige. He turned around and walked slowly out of the office, his heavy footsteps echoing down the long hallway. He did not wait for his wife. He did not hold the door for her. He abandoned her just as quickly as she had betrayed him. Melissa stood there for a few seconds longer, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest. She looked down at the 3 folders sitting on my desk, the physical manifestation of her complete destruction. She finally realized that her arrogant assumption of my weakness was the most expensive mistake she would ever make in her entire life. She turned around and practically ran down the hallway, desperate to escape the crushing weight of her own failure. I stood alone in my quiet office and listened to the heavy front door slam shut. I listened to the separate sounds of their luxury cars violently starting in my driveway. They sped off in completely different directions, leaving behind a trail of dust and shattered illusions. The unified front of the thieves was permanently fractured. They had arrived at my home together, completely convinced they could easily bully an old man into submission. They left completely alone, absolutely terrified, and fully aware that their privileged lives were completely over. The trap had executed perfectly, and the absolute justice I sought was finally complete. I did not stay inside my quiet home after they drove away in their separate vehicles. I walked out to my old pickup truck and drove straight to the upscale medical district. I needed to witness the absolute finality of my legal strategy executing in the real world. By the time I pulled up to the sleek glass building, the gears of justice were already grinding their fake empire into dust. Simon had coordinated the commercial seizure perfectly. A team of private security contractors and 2 uniformed sheriff deputies were already standing inside the beautiful lobby. A professional commercial locksmith was actively drilling out the heavy brass deadbolts on the front glass doors. There were several wealthy clients standing outside on the pristine sidewalk, completely confused by the chaotic scene. They were holding their expensive designer handbags and looking through the large windows at the uniformed officers standing next to the imported Italian marble desk. These were the exact elite socialites my son had desperately tried to impress by giving away free cosmetic procedures. Now they were watching his luxury medical practice being actively raided by law enforcement. Aaron and Melissa arrived at the clinic just minutes after I did. Their 2 expensive luxury cars screeched into the premium parking spots near the back entrance. They practically sprinted toward the building, completely desperate to somehow stop the inevitable collapse they had just learned about in my kitchen. But the heavy glass doors were already locked from the inside by the private security team. Aaron pounded his fists against the thick glass, completely abandoning his polished professional demeanor. He saw his wealthy clients staring at him from the sidewalk, and his face flushed with intense humiliation. He desperately tried to put on his charming medical visionary smile, but he was sweating profusely, and his expensive designer shirt was still completely wrinkled from our intense confrontation. He loudly shouted through the glass, trying to tell his patients that it was just a minor administrative error and that his clinic would be fully operational in a few short hours. I instructed the head security guard to open the door just enough to let my son and his wife step inside the lobby. I wanted this absolute dismantling to happen exactly where they had built their massive lies. Aaron stumbled into the room immediately, trying to take control of the narrative. He pointed at the uniformed deputies and aggressively demanded that they leave his private property. Simon stepped forward from the shadows, holding the thick stack of official court-ordered foreclosure documents. He did not speak quietly. Simon has a voice perfectly trained for a loud courtroom, and he utilized it flawlessly. He announced to the entire room, including the wealthy clients who were peering through the open doorway, that the dermatology practice was officially legally seized. He stated clearly that the seizure was due to severe commercial fraud and a complete default on a senior secured loan. The wealthy clients outside gasped in unison. The carefully crafted illusion of extreme wealth and medical prestige was completely publicly shattered in a matter of seconds. The clients immediately pulled out their cell phones and began typing furiously, undoubtedly spreading the incredible scandal to every single country club and elite social circle in the entire city. Melissa completely panicked. She suddenly realized that if the clinic was entirely seized, the federal financial investigators would soon be tearing through her private administrative office. She knew her computer hard drive contained all the fraudulent invoices and the digital banking transfers she had used to embezzle my money. She desperately tried to dart past the private security guards and sprint down the pristine white hallway toward her office. She screamed that she needed to collect her private medical records and her personal belongings before anyone else touched her desk. A large uniformed security guard stepped effortlessly into her path and firmly blocked the hallway. Simon looked at her with absolute disgust and calmly delivered the brutal legal reality. He informed her that every single item inside the entire building completely belonged to the private holding company. He told her the commercial lien covered her computer, her physical filing cabinets, and the imported marble desk she used to hide her crimes. He clearly warned her that if she attempted to touch a single piece of corporate property, she would be immediately arrested for evidence tampering and federal theft. Melissa physically recoiled as if Simon had struck her. She looked around the lavish waiting room she had personally designed and realized she was a complete stranger in a building she used to rule. Aaron slowly turned to look at me. I was standing near the back wall watching the entire pathetic scene unfold with absolute cold detachment. He walked slowly toward me, his eyes completely begging for a final shred of parental mercy. He lowered his voice to a pathetic whisper and asked me how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He told me I was completely humiliating him in front of the most important people in the entire city and destroying his only chance at a successful life. I looked at my son and felt absolutely no pity. I replied that I was not the one who humiliated him. I told him he had completely humiliated himself the very moment he decided to fund his arrogant vanity with stolen money. I reminded him that he was the one who handed his financial future over to a greedy parasite because he was too obsessed with taking pictures with internet influencers to actually run a profitable business. I told him the destruction of his dream was entirely his own fault, and I was simply the man collecting the overdue bill. The commercial locksmith finished installing the heavy new deadbolts on the front entrance. The uniformed deputies formally instructed the remaining patients on the sidewalk that all future medical appointments were permanently canceled and they should seek treatment elsewhere. The wealthy socialites quickly walked away to their expensive cars, shaking their heads and whispering about the absolute disgrace of the Gallagher family clinic. Aaron's professional reputation was completely bleeding out right there on the pristine white floor, and there was absolutely no medical procedure in the world that could ever fix it. Simon reached behind the marble reception desk and pulled out two small, empty cardboard boxes. He walked over and handed one box to Aaron and one box to Melissa. He told them they were legally permitted to take only their personal car keys, their cell phones, and the coats currently on their backs. He strictly informed them that absolutely nothing else was permitted to leave the premises. Melissa desperately tried to grab a small, expensive, decorative vase from the lobby side table, claiming it was a personal wedding gift. The security guard immediately stepped forward and firmly took the vase right out of her trembling hands, placing it safely behind the desk. She was not allowed to take a single penny of my investment out of that building. Then began the final walk of absolute shame. The two uniformed sheriff deputies flanked my son and his wife and firmly instructed them to walk toward the exit. Aaron and Melissa slowly walked out of the beautiful glass doors holding absolutely nothing but two empty cardboard boxes. The heavy mechanical sound of the new deadbolts clicking firmly into place echoed loudly through the quiet street. They were officially locked out of their own fake reality forever. They stood on the cold concrete sidewalk, completely isolated from the luxurious world they had stolen. They had no medical clinic, they had no operating capital, and they were entirely facing massive federal criminal charges for their extensive commercial fraud. They did not speak to each other. They just walked slowly toward their expensive leased cars, completely broken by the crushing weight of their own monumental greed. I stood inside the quiet lobby and looked around at the empire I had just legally conquered. The air conditioning hummed softly, pushing the scent of eucalyptus through the empty waiting room. The clinic was completely silent, but it finally felt clean. The toxic parasites had been forcefully removed, and the host was completely cured. The legal checkmate was flawlessly executed, and my retirement funds were officially safe. I walked over to the complimentary champagne bar, poured myself a small glass of sparkling water, and raised it toward the empty room. The lesson was completely delivered, and the absolute truth had finally won. The weeks following the commercial seizure were a masterclass in the absolute brutal efficiency of the legal system. I did not need to speak to my son or his wife to know exactly how their lives were unraveling. Simon provided me with regular detailed updates from the ongoing federal financial investigation and the civil bankruptcy proceedings. The absolute destruction of their fake empire was completely methodical and beautifully permanent. Aaron quickly discovered that the elite medical community he had so desperately tried to court was completely unforgiving. The viral video from the humiliated internet influencer had permanently stained his professional name. No private luxury practice in the city would even consider hiring him. The wealthy socialites who used to drink his complimentary champagne now openly mocked him at their exclusive country clubs. His reputation was toxic, and his professional network completely abandoned him the very moment he lost his expensive imported marble waiting room. But the most terrifying reality Aaron had to face was the massive mountain of debt slowly crushing him. Although I had legally seized the clinic assets, the commercial equipment, and the plush velvet furniture did not completely cover the massive remaining balance of the $900,000 loan. Furthermore, the federal authorities heavily fined him for his gross negligence regarding the leased medical lasers. The medical board threatened to completely revoke his license if he filed for personal bankruptcy to escape his federal fines. To avoid total destruction and keep his medical license, Aaron was forced to accept the only employment available to a disgraced doctor. He was forced to take a grueling entry-level position at a severely underfunded public health clinic on the far south side of the city. The contrast between his fake luxury past and his harsh new reality was absolutely staggering. He traded his custom-tailored white coat for a cheap paper gown. He no longer spent his afternoons performing expensive cosmetic laser treatments on local celebrities while smelling expensive eucalyptus diffusers. Instead, He spent 14 hours a day standing under buzzing fluorescent lights, smelling strong, cheap bleach, and treating severe skin infections. He spent his days draining painful abscesses and working in a chaotic, overcrowded waiting room filled with exhausted people who could not afford to pay him in cash. He was paid a tiny fraction of his former salary. He worked grueling double shifts just to keep up with the aggressive minimum payments the court ordered him to make to my holding company. Simon told me that Aaron looked completely exhausted walking out of the clinic at midnight, his shoulders heavy with the absolute crushing weight of actual honest labor. He was finally learning the exact same brutal lesson I learned 40 years ago pouring wet concrete in the freezing rain. He learned that respect is earned through sweat and sacrifice, not bought with stolen retirement funds. While Aaron was busy learning the true meaning of hard work, Melissa was experiencing a completely different kind of nightmare. Her extravagant lifestyle evaporated into thin air almost overnight. The federal investigators immediately froze all of her personal bank accounts, suspecting that the funds were entirely the product of her massive embezzlement scheme. The luxury slate gray Porsche was quickly repossessed by the dealership right out of her driveway because she completely missed 3 consecutive monthly payments. She was forced to trade her expensive designer heels for cheap walking shoes just to take the public bus across town. The lavish weekend spa retreats and the imported jewelry were permanently gone, replaced by the terrifying reality of unpaid utility bills and endless calls from aggressive debt collectors. Melissa possessed absolutely no actual marketable skills. Her fake consulting company was completely dissolved by the state, and her resume was nothing but a string of fabricated administrative titles. Every single time she applied for a simple office job, the hiring manager would run a standard background check and immediately discover the pending federal financial fraud investigation. Nobody wanted to hire a woman who had actively embezzled tens of thousands of dollars from her own family. She quickly realized that the glamorous life she felt so incredibly entitled to was never coming back. Because she was a creature built entirely on greed and self-preservation, she decided to completely abandon the sinking ship. She refused to lower her standard of living to support a disgraced public clinic doctor. Just 3 months after the clinic was seized, she formally filed for divorce. She hired a cheap, desperate divorce attorney, completely expecting to extract a massive financial settlement from Aaron. She truly believed she could legally secure half of whatever remaining assets he possessed and demand permanent alimony based on his future earnings as a medical professional. She marched into the small, cramped divorce mediation room, wearing the last clean designer outfit she owned, completely expecting to walk away a wealthy victim. She sat across from my son, with her chin held high, still foolishly believing she was the smartest person in the room. She had entirely forgotten about a quiet dinner we had exactly 5 years ago, right before their wedding. During that dinner, I explicitly told Aaron that I would not pay for his expensive medical school tuition unless he secured his future assets with an ironclad prenuptial agreement. I had Simon personally draft the legal document. It was a ruthless, comprehensive contract specifically designed to protect my financial investments from any potential future spouses. Melissa had eagerly signed that prenuptial agreement 5 years ago because Aaron had promised her a lifetime of endless wealth, and she simply did not care about the boring legal details at the time. As she sat in the divorce mediation room confidently demanding spousal support, Aaron silently pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase. He was completely exhausted, and his eyes carried the dark, heavy bags of a man who worked 14-hour shifts, but he still managed to find the strength to deliver the final blow. He silently slid the original signed prenuptial agreement across the table. The cheap divorce attorney picked up the document and quickly read through the clauses. The color completely drained from the attorney's face. He turned to Melissa and immediately told her the horrifying truth. The contract explicitly stated that in the event of a divorce caused by financial fraud, criminal negligence, or gross financial mismanagement, she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. The prenuptial agreement specifically protected all business assets, all future medical earnings, and all personal property from being divided. Melissa started screaming at her attorney, demanding that he fight the contract in court. The attorney calmly packed his briefcase and told her that the document was completely bulletproof. He told her that because she was currently under federal investigation for embezzling funds from the marital business, no judge in the entire country would ever invalidate the agreement to give her a massive payout. He told her she was completely wasting his time, and he walked right out of the room. She was left sitting at the table completely alone. She would receive no alimony. She would receive no portion of his meager public health salary. She was legally stripped of everything she had ever touched. She walked out of that mediation room completely empty-handed, stepping out into the cold city street with no money, no car, no husband, and absolutely no future. The arrogant woman who had openly mocked my worn-out clothes and proudly excluded me from her grand opening was now completely ruined. The justice I demanded was not just loud, it was incredibly precise. Her complete and absolute destruction was finally achieved, leaving her to fade away into the exact same shadows she had once tried to force me into. With the toxic parasites permanently removed from the host, my beautiful glass building sat completely empty for exactly 2 months. The heavy new deadbolts kept the expensive imported Italian marble and the high-tech medical lasers safely locked away in the dark. A weaker man might have simply sold the entire property at a massive loss just to completely wash his hands of the painful family tragedy. But I am not a weak man, and I am certainly not a man who accepts a financial loss. I am a commercial real estate developer. When a building catches fire, you do not abandon the land. You clear away the blackened rubble, you pour a fresh concrete foundation, and you build something much stronger in its place. I had a fully furnished, state-of-the-art luxury medical facility, completely wired and ready for immediate operation. I owned the building lease, I owned the expensive velvet furniture, and because I had legally absorbed the vendor debt, I owned every single piece of advanced surgical machinery inside those walls. I simply needed to find the right people to turn my dead asset into a highly performing investment. I called Simon and gave him very specific instructions for the new tenant search. I told him I did not want any arrogant established doctors who cared more about their social status than their actual patients. I wanted the exact opposite of my son. I wanted young, hungry first-generation medical professionals. I wanted doctors who actually understood the crushing weight of student debt and knew the absolute value of a hard-earned dollar. Within 3 weeks, Simon found exactly what I was looking for. He introduced me to a group of 3 young, brilliant dermatologists. They had all graduated at the absolute top of their medical school classes, but they were completely buried under hundreds of thousands of dollars in unforgiving student loans. They were currently working exhausting, grueling shifts at a massive, faceless corporate hospital because they simply did not have the massive capital required to open their own private practice. They could not afford to buy expensive medical lasers or lease premium commercial space in the elite medical district. I arranged to meet them at the empty clinic on a bright Tuesday morning. When I unlocked the heavy glass doors and turned on the bright lights, they walked into the pristine lobby with absolute awe. They ran their hands over the Italian marble reception desk and looked at the expensive eucalyptus diffusers, completely terrified to even touch anything. When I showed them the private procedure rooms fully equipped with the absolute latest medical technology, they looked like starving people who had just been invited to a massive royal banquet. We sat down in the beautiful administrative office, the exact same room where Melissa had desperately tried to threaten me with fake lawsuits. The 3 young doctors sat nervously across from me, completely expecting me to demand a predatory financial arrangement. They knew they had zero leverage, and they were absolutely desperate for this rare opportunity. I did not take advantage of their desperation. I placed a standard fair commercial lease agreement on the marble desk. I offered them a complete turnkey operation. They could immediately take over the fully furnished luxury clinic and utilize every single piece of advanced medical equipment to treat their own patients. In exchange, they would pay me a strict, flat monthly commercial rent. I did not ask for a percentage of their future medical profits, and I did not demand any administrative control over their daily business operations. I simply wanted a reliable, guaranteed return on my original investment. The young doctors read the contract and they were completely overwhelmed with genuine gratitude. They did not roll their eyes at the legal paperwork. They did not ask for expensive luxury cars or